to Perimenopausal Athletes and Beyond, a masterclass series that we are bringing together experts in mindset, nutrition, training, and recover. My name is Tennille Hooklin. I am the founder and owner of Element Sports Coaching, and I have the incredible privilege of bringing two awesome humans together for this particular interview, and it is Trevor, Connor, and Rob Pickels. So welcome to the series.
Thank you for having us on the show. It's a real honor. We've been excited about this.
We're looking forward to it. I think it's going to be a great conversation, and Tennille, I bet there's a lot we can learn from you. So I'm always into that.
Well, this is truly going to be a dialogue, and I have literally been so excited because it's bringing in, so where we're going to go, and I'm going to introduce you in a second, but where we're going to go, everybody, is we're going to start more high level and talking about how to train, thinking about high intensity interval training, and then coming down to even like at the cellular level of like what is actually happening and why we want to basically have it all for health and for our performance. So let me introduce these two awesome humans. First of all, Trevor, Connor. Say hi, Trevor, so they know which one is you.
I'm Trevor.
That's
hi.
Trevor. Is an exercise physiology. He's an endurance sports coach for athletes of all levels. He has raced as a professional cycling and in the professional cycling world and in the peloton for over 20 years. What is interesting and what I really think brings so much value to this whole conversation is all the sides that Trevor has worked on with athletes. So he's been in the manager, he's been in the physiology component, he has worked in endurance world and nutrition and health world. He's been, writing a ton. He is one of the hosts for Fast Talk, which is I'm going to talk a lot about Fast Talk a little bit here. So the podcast that I encourage you all to start following. And what else can I say? Oh, and this is a little interesting factoid that I learned that I didn't know, is that his master thesis advisor was Dr. Lauren Cordain, who is the originator of the paleo diet. And Trevor is now the CEO of the paleo diet, which is really interesting and just brings in more perspective of where he's coming from. So welcome, Trevor.
Thank you. That made me sound really good. I actually call all that having a hard time picking what I'm doing with my life. But thank you for making it sound nice.
But that's often among coaches, right? Like we have our hands in so many things, and because we have to have a really broad landscape to be able to do our jobs well. So that makes sense. So Rob Pickels is an exercise physiologist as well. He leads Fast Talk Laboratories as the chief operating officer and the chief product officer. And his sporting background was originally in the field sports, and then he became a runner, and then he dabbled into triathlon, and then he became a cyclist. Actually, it was I never did the running part. I did the swimming, and then I did the triathlon. But now, you can't get me off my bike, and there's so many more bikes that we can have. So it gets really exciting. But in any case, a little bit of a different, diverse background. He was the lead physiologist for Boulder Center for Sports Medicine and the University of Colorado Sports Medicine and Performance Center. He loves cyclocross and mountain bike races, and he is a very well published researcher as well. So we're in good company. So that's basically, there's more to be said about their bios, but I'm going to leave it there and we're going to hop into the interview itself. So we are really wanting to dive in today into the physiology of how do we as female athletes, as we approach perimenopause, are in perimenopause and in the beyond menopause, how do we train that really maximizes our time, because a lot of us don't have very much time. And we want to think about how do we maximize our health. And then what does the difference from the health into the performance? So the first question I have, and this is all in the context of female athletes, estrogen is lowering. We understand that we need to do more strength training to maintain our muscle mass. We understand that we need to, do the high intensity to keep our fitness. And where I want to ask you, and just to start, is what is high intensity training? And then what is high intensity interval training? And is there a difference?
Trevor, I think this is your baby, so I'm going to let you start with that, and then I'll take some of the more difficult questions that come later in the episode.
You know, we did a whole episode of our show on basically what is the difference between these two, and we found a really good definition of both that I wish I could remember off the top of my head right now. But basically, the way when I talk to my athletes about HIT versus HIIT, it's really a scientific definition versus a more, just common language definition. To me, right, HIT, high intensity training, is just basically going and doing anything that's hard. So you can go and do intervals, you're doing high intensity. You can go to the local training race and race your guts out for 30 minutes and you're doing high intensity. HIIT, high intensity interval training, that's what you see in the literature. And that's referring to a structured workout where you're doing something that's going to be at threshold or above. So if you're doing kind of something, so I like to talk about that 3-zone model, and I'll quickly define that because I'll probably refer to that a few times. But we have 2 thresholds. Everybody knows about our upper threshold. That's your anaerobic or lactate threshold. A lot of different names for it. Mm-hmm. Think of it, if you're going out and doing a time trial, that's what you're about the intensity you're going to race at. Mm-hmm. That's your upper threshold. But we actually have a lower threshold called your aerobic threshold. That's usually about 85% of that anaerobic threshold. Mm-hmm. So you have these 2 thresholds. And when you talk about a 3-zone model, zone 1 is below the aerobic threshold. Zone 2 is between the aerobic and the anaerobic threshold. And then zone 3 is above that anaerobic threshold. So HIIT is doing any sort of structured work where you're at or above, basically in zone 3.
Okay. Could you help us, for those that are trying to still understand, like in terms of perceived effort or perceived exertion, what would that mean if you put it on a scale of 1 to 10?
The HIIT?
Yeah. For the zone 3, where would that land? Can you talk?
It's a big range. So if you're at the low end of zone 3, if you're doing that right at that threshold, that's an intensity you should be able to hold for 20 minutes to an hour.
Right.
Working in that threshold range. So that's going to be hard. You're not going to be holding a conversation with somebody, but you could still talk.
Yeah.
So, on an RPE scale, let's say a 10-point, let's just go a simple 10-point RPE scale. You're maybe at a 7. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But as you get higher and higher in that zone 3, like if you're going out and doing sprints, you aren't talking, you're doing something that you can only hold for 15, 20 seconds, and you're going to be gasping for air at the end of that. Yeah. So that zone 3 is a big range. So when you're talking about HIIT work, it can be anything from, 10-minute intervals with 10-minute rests or 5-minute rests, and you repeat that 4 or 5 times, to just doing short 10-second sprint intervals.
Right.
The other aspect when we're considering rating of perceived exertion with this zone 3 or HIIT work is the duration that you're doing the activity for. Mm-hmm. At the very onset of that 5-minute interval or 30-second interval, it might not feel very hard. That might just be an RPE of 5. Right. You give that a couple minutes, or you go deep into the set and you've done 10 repetitions. Suddenly that 5 feels like a 10. And you haven't actually worked any harder. And that's a little bit different from maybe more of the moderate intensity continuous work that you would do down in a zone 1. You would set out and do that, and it would be a rating of perceived exertion of 3, and it would probably stay about a 3. Maybe it would drift up a little bit to a 4 after 1 or 2 hours worth of work. And so that's where going with rating of perceived exertion is actually oftentimes difficult at these highest intensity levels, because it changes very quickly as you start to fatigue or become glycogen depleted or anything else.
Yeah. Yeah, because it is actually really interesting because we were doing, I use a 7-zone system. And so we were doing a zone 5 workout yesterday, and the first one definitely feels different than that last one.
The first one feels great.
Yep.
It's like, oh yeah, I've got this, but
you're queen of the world on the first one. And by the end, not so much.
There's so many different types of high intensity interval training work. You can could keep prescribing them in different ways. You could keep making them up until the cows come home. But something that I always tell my athletes whenever I have them doing interval work is 2 things. One is I want consistency. So one of my favorite intervals is 5 by 5 minute intervals with 1 minute rest. And I tell my athletes, I want you doing it at an intensity where your average wattage for the first interval and the last interval are the same. All the intervals have to be the same wattage. Same thing if I gave them Tabatas, 20-10. So you do 20 seconds as hard as you can go, and then 10 seconds easy, and then 20 seconds. And you do that for 5-6 minutes. Same thing. I want to see all those 20-second efforts about the same wattage. So when I actually prescribe the intensity to my athletes, I don't give them a specific, you have to do it at this wattage number or this heart rate or this speed, depending on whether they're running or biking or what sport they're doing. I always say, I want consistency, and I want it to be as hard as you can go, but where you can still be consistent. So where I see athletes not doing the interval work well is when they hit that first interval super hard. So let's say they hit that at 280 watts, and then they do the next one at 260, and then the third one's at 210, and they're just kind of fading. That means they hit the first one too hard and they couldn't sustain it. If they do that first one at 280, I don't want to see any of them below 270.
And I think that this is a really important distinction, because we're talking about high intensity interval training, in which case we're trying to keep this workload with a relatively short rest. We're trying to keep this workload relatively similar from the start to the finish of the workout. In the literature, there is an alternative that is sprint interval training, right? Which is even higher workload. It's 100%. It's maximal effort for every single one. But the big difference there is that those intervals are very short and the restoration is very long, so that you can recover and you can do the next one at that full workload again. And, it seems like the majority of the improvements that are coming with training oftentimes are coming on the high intensity interval side of things. Now, sprint interval is definitely worthwhile depending on what sport you're engaged in and the specific needs of that. But when we're talking about endurance athletes, it's that high intensity interval training that we're describing that's ultimately probably more beneficial.
Yes.
So when it comes, so let's think about this for the athletes that are listening in terms of like, okay, I want to be fit, I want to be strong, but I'm more interested in longevity than being on top of the podium. Yes, I want to get to the finish line, or yes, I want to, feel good by the end of my event. But more important to me is that I can just have that consistency. My specific question is this: does it matter, or are there differences for female athletes specifically in whether we do the hit 30-second on, 15-second off, keep it really short, whole workout is between 30-40 minutes, and these longer intervals in which we're, plugging away for those 5 minutes hard, 1 minute off? And when would we use, what does that progression look like? Or is there a progression, or is it a little bit of everything that you're not going to go at fault? If you're staying in that zone 3, awesome, you're getting your heart rate up. Like, how do we think about it as athletes and coaches for our female athletes in perimenopause and beyond?
I don't know who wants to jump on it first, but maybe Trevor and I are going to give the same answer.
Yeah.
Why don't you go ahead, and then I'll throw my answer out. That's going to be interesting.
Here's the thing. I think that the recommendation, in all honesty, is relatively similar between if you just want to be healthy, live a life with a reduced risk for cardiovascular disease, or if you want to be an incredible athlete. It's similar recommendations. Maybe what changes is the amount of work that you're doing, how many hours per week you're doing. It obviously needs to go up if you want to improve performance. Maybe what changes is how deep you're pushing yourself on each interval. But the general recommendation, in all honesty, between male and female, between healthy and endurance performance, is the majority of your work really ought to be at that lower intensity level. We get so much benefit from the quote unquote base or zone 1 or zone 2 if you're in a 7 or 5 zone model. We get so much benefit there, and we're able to handle that load without undue stress on our body, that really the majority of the work ought to be in that low intensity. And then a remaining amount, maybe 20-ish% ought to be at that very high intensity. Now, this helps just general fitness because of things like blood pressure regulation. We have really great improvements in blood pressure control with that really high, hard intensity work. We're really challenging the cardiovascular system to adapt there in ways that we're not when we go easy.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are benefits there for racing too, but both of them are important regardless of what your goal is.
Yeah, no, couldn't agree more. Whether you're doing this for performance or whether you're doing this for health, that balance element is really important. I see too many athletes who are saying, I'm just doing this for fitness. I don't care that much about performance. So I'm just going to go to the gym 5 days a week and destroy myself.
Yeah.
That's not a great formula, because first of all, as Rob was pointing out, there are benefits you get from that low intensity side that you don't get from the high intensity side, and vice versa. So you're going to get greater health benefits from mixing the two. The other thing is, well, there are benefits from that high intensity. That high intensity work is also very damaging. Produces a lot of autonomic stress. It produces a lot of oxidative stress. So if you're going into the gym and constantly hitting yourself hard, you're actually also doing some things that are going to be damaging to your body that you need to help your body adapt to. Going to that oxidative stress, because I know everybody's heard about that and worries about that, and we all take our antioxidants.
Right.
One of the most fascinating studies I ever read was about cyclists and how their bodies handle oxidative stress. And they compared fairly recreational cyclists to top level cyclists. So this was the top level. These were riders at the Dauphiné getting ready for the Tour de France.
Right.
And they were looking at the impact of racing and training on their overall oxidative stress in their bodies. And what you saw with the much lower level recreational riders was, when they started racing and doing a lot of hard work, oxidative stress in their bodies got very high. And you could get it to a point where their bodies couldn't tolerate it. Surprisingly, these athletes at the Dauphiné, so this is a race where it's 10-day race?
Longer than that, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a longer race. You're doing 4 or 5 hours a day. You're killing yourself 4 or 5 hours a day. And while they produced a huge amount of oxidants, their natural built-in body's ability to address these oxidants, I'm misspoken, but their natural antioxidants, there's a much simpler way of putting it, were so good that their overall oxidative stress level went down over the course of the race. Wow. So continuing that research, so we actually did a whole episode on this. A lot of that lower intensity work is what helps your body build that resistance to oxidative stress. So if you're going into the gym and constantly doing that HIIT work, constantly going hard, and you're never going out and doing those longer, slow rides, you're going to build up a lot of oxidative stress, which you don't want, and you're not helping your body learn how to tolerate it.
Correct. And then we have increased cortisol with the high intensity. We have increased, say, systemic inflammation. And I think that we know that has long-term ramifications for things like cardiovascular health, because when we start talking about depositing, say, calcium into our peripheral artery system, and then that leads to cardiovascular disease and whatnot. I'm not saying that high intensity work, leads to these things, but it is associated with things like increased systemic inflammation.
Yeah. So I have a question, but I just want to add one more point to that. And what I see is when we start to do too much intensity, we actually don't hit intensity. And
yes.
Right. And so why another reason for zone 2, and we're going to get into it more, is why zone 2 is because obviously we need the recovery time. But one thing that I see among many athletes, and when I get a new athlete, it's always like, all right, let's see, because you have no idea how strong you are.
Yeah.
You have no idea how strong you are and where you're going to go with this. And so what you think is a perceived effort of, an 8 now, let me tell you, you're going to learn how to do intensity. And this is where, okay, I'm going to be totally straight with the audience. I am a paying member of Fast Talk Laboratories because it's brilliant. So just know that I'm just putting out there. They didn't ask me to say this, but the reason why, and I want you to listen and take this on as coaches or take this on as athletes, is that there's so many ways we can do intensity. And this is going to come into a little bit of a tie into a question. Is part of having this diversity of intensity, so we can keep on straining our body in other ways. So we want strain because strain is going to break us down so we can build back up, essentially, right? So when it comes to understanding intensity, we get to do it all for the health. But how do we, so that's one thing. That's one question. Do we get to and want to mix it up so we throw our body into something a little different once in a while? And then when is it that we actually want to get into more specificity of, you're going to be doing a really hilly, hard ride, like the hills are going to be, let's define it. Hills are not long. They're going to be short and hard. And it's more of a time trial race because these are endurance athletes. They're not necessarily in a cycling race. Let's put them they're triathletes. Let's put them there. So when do we want to have more specificity coming into those intervals?
Specificity, this has always been an interesting debate because there is that question of which is better training, specificity training or energy system training. And you probably already know I'm more on that energy system. Yeah. I know coaches who basically they figure out what's the athlete's primary event, and all training all season is specific to that particular event. Mm-hmm. There are pros and cons of that. I think there are times for specificity. My short answer to the question is you should do some specific training, but it's only a few sessions and you should do that close to the event. Mm-hmm. My personal feeling is you are trying to train an engine. And I think you should be building as powerful an engine as you can, and then let the engine figure out the event. Versus, the issue with doing specificity is you might not be building as well-rounded an engine. You might be building an engine that's got really, particular aspects to it that are really strong that you think you need for that event. But the overall engine isn't going to be as strong. And so I don't like the specificity approach as much. I'm just on that, let's figure out a good training plan to build as big and as strong an engine as possible, and then go to an event and figure out how to use that engine.
Yeah, I like to take this outside of sports a little bit. And let's say we're trying to build a cake, right? There are just general principles to what makes a good cake, and good cakes are good cakes, and they typically follow a lot of the same rules, right? Yep. and that's training, you know what I mean? But that last 10% is maybe specificity. That's exactly what is the frosting, and maybe one person ends up preferring one frosting over another, but they're still both great cakes. It's the same thing with training. Majority of your stuff should be easy. Some of your stuff should be hard. As long as we're following that, we're getting 85 or 90% of the improvement that we can expect to get. Now, like Trevor, I do think that with some events, and if let's say you're going from a 40K time trialist who's just sort of hammering out a flat course to somebody who's doing hills, sure, as part of that 20% zone 3 or above threshold work, you're doing, maybe you switch from longer 20-minute intervals and you switch to maybe some shorter 5-minute or whatever else intervals. You're not changing the formula. You're just adding some vanilla instead of some chocolate, but it's still the same sort of just flavoring at the end.
Right.
And I do this, with my wife. I'm not a coach. I coach exactly one person. It's my wife. And she is a very competitive 10,000 meter runner on the track, but She, maybe sometimes wants to focus a little bit more on the 5K or a little bit more on the half marathon. We always know she's going to be a 10K runner. And for the most part, training is relatively the same no matter the event we're doing. Really, what's changing is maybe the length of the intervals and the final preparation for what she's doing to be a little bit more specific to the event. But like Trevor, we're focused on building the aerobic system. We're focused on building the anaerobic system. That's first and foremost.
So they did a really interesting study where they actually took runners, and they took runners who were doing different length events from the 5,000 meter to the marathon, and then looked at how specific their training was.
Yeah.
And what was shocking about this study was the athletes who spent the most time training at the specific speed for their event performed the worst.
Yep.
Oh, interesting.
And the athletes who performed the best actually didn't spend a lot of time training at the specific speed for their event. And that goes back to they were doing training that was really trying to optimally develop their aerobic systems, build that engine.
One thing that I want to add into this, because I always try to look at this as a holistic sort of manner, is for some athletes, especially, there is more to training beyond the physiological side of things. And that comes into the psychological side.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that there is benefit to allowing athletes, certain athletes in particular, to just experience what the heck it's going to feel like, so that on race day or in the performance, they know what to expect. And sometimes if you do have athletes who haven't ever climbed that hill, who don't know what it feels like to feel that burn at the end of a 2-minute very hard effort, a bit of training can certainly be helpful there. But again, that's not to target physiology.
Right.
It's to think about it as more of a holistic situation.
Yeah. I think that's super important. Like it's maybe, is there a study that actually looked at, is it the specificity itself of doing the interval, or is it that you, in your mindset, you've said, I know I've been there before, I can do it again?
So what I would say to that, and I agree with Rob completely, I think the biggest value of doing specific work is the mental side. Mm-hmm. And I would say actually one of the things they have to constantly address when they design research studies is that learning effect. Mm-hmm. That if you have somebody do a particular protocol and then you're trying to see if your intervention brought about improvements or not, you always have that issue that the second time they repeat that protocol, they're going to do better just from the learning effect, the familiarity with it. So going and doing something similar to your race or your target event, and getting that familiarity is actually just going to make you better because you're now going to know how to do it.
Yeah. It's super important. Okay. That is absolutely brilliant. I love all of this. Okay. So you had referred to within your answer, the 80-20. So I just want to like bring that up and mention that Dr. Steven Seiler, is the can I say guru? Like he's just the founder of the
He's
principle.
The guy. Well,
he is the guy.
I called him Jay-Z, the Jay-Z of exercise science. So,
and he is also an expert that is commonly and often contributing to Fast Talk. So I want to just another little thing of like, if you want to understand the 80-20, then you want to know about the work of Dr. Steven Seiler. Now we've talked a lot about the 20%. That's the high intensity. Yep. That's the zone 3 for my athletes that are listening, zone 4 and up. And we now want to talk about, and you've alluded to how important this zone 2 is. And there was another fantastic interview that you had on your podcast. So another reason to go to the podcast, and that is with Dr. Milan. Mm-hmm. And he was talking about, how zone 2, so we know zone 2 is the foundation, it's for our aerobic system, but he was talking about more, how it's supporting and I'm going to just turn it over really quickly because you're going to speak to it much more better, but like at the mitochondrial level. And what I want to know is do we know any difference between females and males at that really mitochondrial level of why we would want to do less of zone 2 as we age as female athletes? Or like, do we even have that science yet? Or is this a good question? I'm not sure.
Well, I think it's a good question, but I think that there's a couple questions that are in there.
Okay.
Are there differences at the mitochondrial level between men and women?
Yeah.
If you look at the groups as a whole and you match them as best you can, and you compare based just on gender, yeah, there probably is a difference between men and women. Women seem to, again, when matched, oxidize more fat as fuel than men do. As you ramp up exercise intensity, men seem to switch over to using carbohydrate sooner than women do. And if we look at this in a performance sense, look at world records. They're further apart for men and women when we talk about strength and power events, and then they slowly come together as event distances get longer.
Right.
And that's probably because women in general, again, when matched to men, and we're just looking at gender, exhibit a little bit more mitochondrial power, a little bit more aerobic efficiency, a little bit better fat burning. The second part of this, though, is should we be altering what we're doing based on that? And that's where I think it becomes significantly more difficult to answer. And I think that that's where you're going to get a lot of debate. I think I'm on the fence at this point of saying, again, I think that good training is good training. I don't know that we necessarily want to change things. The only way that you would is based on the goals of the event that that person has. But again, that is a theory that I would apply to men and women equally, right? If you need to be really good at doing aerobic things because you're trying to do an Ironman triathlon, well, then you need to really focus on the aerobic system. It doesn't matter if you're male or female in that regard. So I think that I'm both acknowledging that, yes, there are differences, but then questioning if those differences really need functional changes in training.
I used to train at the Canadian National Center up in British Columbia, and two of my favorite training partners, because they trained really smart, were two women, Melanie McQuaid, who's a multi-time world Xterra champion, and Erin Willock, was probably in her prime, Canada's top female athlete. She's been to the Olympics,
right,
or female cyclist. And I can tell you, I mean, we trained together all the time, and our training was not different. There was not well, you're a guy, you should train this way, and you're female, you should train that way. It was really very much the same training, and we all really benefited from it. And I do remember being out for a ride with Erin, and she was talking about the differences. And I always remember her comment, which was just simply, I don't think there's as big a difference between men and women as people like to think. She said, when I'm out riding with you guys, I can hang with you all the time. The only place where I notice any difference is you hit that little 1 minute climb and I have a hard time hanging with you.
Darn it. I hate those 1 minute climbs with
yes.
guys.
And there's a reason for that. And I'm sure a lot of your listeners have read Stacy Sims' book, Roar, and she talks about this. One of the physiological differences between men and women is women have a higher ratio of slow twitch muscle fibers. They don't have that proportion of fast twitch muscle fibers that guys do. So hence, you're going to rely a little more on fat for fuel, because that's what slow twitch muscle fibers love to use.
Yeah.
And it does mean, because when we hit that hill, when you're hitting that 1 minute hill, that's when your fast twitch muscle fibers are going to really kick in and get you over that hill faster. So that's why she said, even though she was a top athlete, that's the one place where she struggles a bit, because the ratios are just a little bit different.
I think when we look at research and we start looking at the research that's trying to break this out by gender, all of the research acknowledges differences in performance. Maybe they say the male group had a higher absolute strength than the female did. But then as they go through a training intervention, oftentimes both groups tend to improve relatively the same.
Right.
And with research, maybe one study shows that one thing is a little better for males and one thing is a little bit better for females. But I think you can find that across any topic in research. Ultimately, what you need before you start making concrete recommendations is consensus in the research. And I don't necessarily know that we have consensus on exactly, say changing interval length being more beneficial for females, versus males. I did see one study that perhaps indicated that women, because they have a better usage of fat and type 1 fibers, that maybe they recover a little bit faster than men do. And therefore their recovery duration while doing an interval workout could be a little bit shorter. and that long intervals, maybe they don't tax females as much as males. That's great in theory, and I fully understand how that could work, but I wouldn't necessarily change anything that I did as a coach or anything that I recommend until I see more than one study that says that, or until I see a lot of different studies that are saying that from different directions. So I don't know that there is or is not a difference, but what I do know is there's no strong support that says we have to absolutely be doing things differently.
Yeah. I could also tell you in general, as a coach myself, very early in my coaching career, I was all about that. You have to find the perfect interval, and I was very worried about all the little details. As I've continued to work with athletes, what I am finding is there's a lot of ways to skin the cat. Forgive the expression, but I've even found with my own training, I can get to about the same place using a variety of different interval workouts, changing up how my week works, that I'm just not that, again, going back to that specificity, I'm not that specific. Yeah. So I have moved more and more towards there's just good training, there's bad training. And as long as you are following generally a good training approach, it's going to get you most of the way there. What I focus more on is just seeing what resonates with every athlete. And it gets down to, even though in the scientific literature, having an N of 1, so this is how many subjects are in your study, you will never publish a study with an N of 1, right, because it's just one individual. But when it comes to our own training, all that matters is the N of 1, what works for you. So what I try to do more is just have a general good training philosophy approach that I apply to everybody, then learn the athlete and really find what resonates for them. So for example, I do love the Tabata intervals, the 20-10s. I have some athletes, I give that to them. They eat it up. They love it. They go and hit it hard. They get a great workout. I have other athletes that go and do it, I hate that. So then it's not an argument of, well, you're going to get really good gains from this, stick with it. It's no, they hate it. They're not going to do it well. They're going to avoid doing it. So let's find a different workout. And I do think some of the same thing applies here. I think it's just follow generally good training principles. And then each woman should be finding out what resonates with me. Try different workouts, try different routines, and go, I found I did this one workout for 6 weeks and I was at one of some of the best form I've ever been on. Yeah. That's one that resonates with you. So use it.
Yeah. And this is where I think context really matters, right? We can say, yeah, there are definitely changes in female athletes compared to men, but as Trevor is saying, it's not the exact same thing that works for everybody. Some people are going to be responders. Some people are going to be non-responders. We know that. But then, I also don't want people to make the leap and say, women do not have the anaerobic power that men might have, relatively speaking, as a general statement. Therefore, women must focus on anaerobic, and they're already good at aerobic. So you don't got to worry about that aerobic thing. You're already good at it. I don't necessarily think that's true unless we understand the context of what people are trying to achieve.
Yeah. So Melanie McQuaid has actually now become a contributor to our website, which I'm really happy about because I really like Melanie. She actually wants to write an article about this, addressing the differences between training for men and women. Yeah. And we talked about it a bit offline, and she did talk about Stacy Sims' book and recognize the value of that book and the importance of saying men and women are different. But then actually Melanie commented to me, her one issue is she feels like there's this trend towards treating women like they are fragile. And she said she doesn't like that. She said, yes, there are differences. She doesn't think it is as big as it's being shown.
I think where we what was said and where we really need to come into is, really what Rob was saying. And it's like, well, is the difference between females, and this is really what you were pointing to, is like, it ends up being the N of 1, as you said. And at the end of the day, it is about the individual. And there are as many differences between men as there are between men and women, or females and males. And therefore, it always has to come down to what you both are saying and saying, how do we training principles, recovery, recover, and let the possibility of the athlete come forward. As you were just saying, Rob, is like, let's not put anybody in a box, because I love it, and we all love it, when athletes break through that box because they believe they could.
Sure.
Because they trained like they knew that they wanted it. And at the end of the day, that's where we want to stay. And, to Trevor, your point is like, I'm not going to make my athlete do something they hate. Well, why are we? I mean, we are so privileged. We're doing sport.
No, that's a good point.
A sport. It's fun.
Yeah,
it's
no
fun.
doubt.
And that's what we come down to. So while we recognize, I think one of an important points at the end of the day is that estrogen is decreasing. We need to be concerned with our muscle mass. We want to be concerned with our bones. We want to make sure that we stay fit and healthy. And, I guess that the last question I would have on this topic is, it's about, when we think about high intensity training, from this conversation, it really leaves me with, it's for the cardiovascular system more so. Like, yes, it's to build the muscles, but it's not so much it's not about the fast twitch versus the slow twitch, or it's about stressing our system at the end of the day, really. And when you come into the sciencey of it, it's like building the motor, like you said, Trevor. It's like, I'm more concerned about the motor, and we need to tap into different components of the energy system. And that's where you get the variability of intervals. Is that correct? Is there anything that
No, I think that's a really good summary. And I'd actually, you brought up bone health. I would love to briefly address that if you had any interest in talking about that.
Yeah.
And I do agree with you. Yes, estrogen is going down. Rob, actually, right before we got on with you, showed me a really interesting study showing, neither of us knew this, and going to get a little into the biochemistry here, that estrogen elevates AMPK. Won't go into the biochemistry, but it's important to know that AMPK is really important in promoting endurance gains. But it can also block another pathway, an mTOR pathway, which is critical towards putting on muscle mass.
Right.
So it's interesting, if estrogen is going down, that it's not going to trigger that AMPK pathway as much. So you might see a little more difficulty in producing some of those endurance gains.
The other thing that you see with that too, when women go from pre through peri into postmenopausal, is changes in lipid profile.
Yeah.
And that seems to be attributed to the decrease in mitochondria and mitochondrial capacity, because estrogen goes down, AMP goes down, or AMPK, sorry, goes down, mitochondria go down, our ability to burn fats as fuel goes down. Suddenly adiposity goes up because we're storing fat, not necessarily burning it. So it is interesting specifically in how the biochemistry of changing estrogen levels has that really direct effect, on both exercise performance, but then also on measures of general health, like body weight, fat free, and fat mass, and everything else.
Oh my goodness, what a point to try to bring this. I mean, I could just keep on talking, but what a point to end this on is that, and because I want that study, I want to read it, and thinking about, because yes, as pre-menopause, before our periods stop, we have this beautiful estrogen. It's helping us, and we need to keep doing that 80% because we're losing it. That's what you're saying. Like, that is so profound and so important, because we're losing it all, because what we are thinking and what we're reading is, just because we are in this state before we lose our period, that we are able to be these amazing endurance athletes, And what you just had explained earlier, Rob, about, it's the difference, we could become closer and closer as we get longer and longer in terms of performance. But that advantage is going to lessen. So if we want to keep doing our long distance rides, our Ironmans or whatever it is, we need to keep on dialing in that zone too. So there, just another plug for it. Oh my goodness, it's so perfect.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh my goodness.
Something. So I to continue with this, to address this a little bit from the nutrition side.
Yeah.
And actually, I went back and last night and just reviewed some of my notes from Stacy Sims' book, and was actually really happy to see her say this as well. That I think this is important at all stages of life for everybody, but particularly as women are going into menopause. Making sure you're getting high quality protein, but B, as athletes, we have this tendency to get these low quality sources of carbohydrate. So we get our gels and our drink mixes. I actually push my athletes away from that and getting most of their carbohydrates from natural sources. But particularly as you go into menopause, making sure you are getting your carbohydrates from fruits and vegetables is more and more important. And this might surprise you, but that is the best thing you can do for bone health. And if you want, I can give you the explanation behind that. But the best thing for bone health is not that calcium supplement that your doctor's telling you to take. It's getting a lot of vegetables, particularly green leafy vegetables, in your diet.
That's super important to, bring in this whole element of nutrition. And we're fortunate to have some phenomenal speakers on, coming in on that, but it's being really widely heard, I believe, that whole foods.
Yes.
Yep. Another thing too, if we can continue teasing out that bone health thread, and I don't want to go too deep. I know we're taking up so much of your time, but, the thing is that running, cycling, definitely, these do not support your bone health. They do not support sort of increased bone density. The things that are going to do that, and as part of just general health, but also exercise performance, things like strength training, that's really going to have more of an implication for improving bone health than any sort of aerobic or anaerobic cardiovascular exercise. And there's research that just doing 10 maximal jumps, stand, squat, jump as high as you can, land, do that 10 times a day, will have increases in bone mineral density over any supplement, anything else that you could be doing. So, this broader picture of health, again, is that variety of exercise can be beneficial, but these things can also be beneficial for performance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is another, the idea of, and Dr. Stacy Sims bringing in this, and the feisty crew, this idea, lift heavy shit, lift heavy shit. We can do it. We can be strong and capable women to do it, is a really important thing. And the reason is partly because of that bone health piece, and it's super valuable.
Sure.
Trevor, we're going to dive in a little bit deeper into the bone health because it's so absolutely critical for female athletes. So can you just share, you have a study there that you wanted to share?
Well, so I'm going to try to summarize some really complex science.
Okay.
But this is a case where the science has completely shifted and a lot of the medical community has not caught up. So I do think it is important to get this message out there. The primary reason for this loss of bone mineral densities for osteoporosis is actually an acidic state in our blood. So if the pH drops in your blood, your body tries to maintain that level. What is the best source of base in your body? It's calcium in your bones.
Right.
So if you get stomach acid, you take a Tums. Tums is basically just calcium.
Right.
So if you're constantly in that low pH state, your body's going to keep leaching the calcium out of your bones to get that pH back up into the right range.
Right.
That is the primary contributor to osteoporosis. One of the big things that causes that, believe it or not, is sodium in our diet. So our bodies have what are called these sodium potassium pumps. At rest, 25% of your energy is going into keeping those pumps running. So it is important that you have the right ratio of sodium and potassium in your body so that those pumps can run effectively. We tend to have a very high sodium diet. So typical Western diet is 2 to 1 sodium to potassium. Natural human diet is 1 to 5 up to 1 to 10 sodium and potassium. So we have completely flipped it.
Oh, wow.
When you are eating that high sodium diet, and this is particularly true of athletes who are constantly told, get your sodium, get your sodium, get your sodium. If you are getting too much sodium, not enough potassium, your body has a hard time pumping sodium out of the cells because it doesn't have sufficient potassium to help run those transporters. Your body has a secondary transporter that can get the sodium out of the cells, and it co-transports sodium. I'm sorry about all the biochemistry, but it co-transports the sodium with a hydrogen ion. And any biochemist, basically hydrogen ions, that's acid. So to get the sodium out of your cells, it's pumping acid into your blood. So recent research, and there's been a bunch of studies on this now, has shown that if you take osteoporotic women and put them on a potassium supplement, they can actually, not only does it reduce or prevent the loss of bone density, you've actually seen them start to regrow bone. And that has been more effective than all these calcium supplements. Actually, most of the research on taking calcium supplements to help with your bones has either shown no benefit or very little benefit. It just slows the growth. So really, we should be focusing on potassium, not calcium. And you should be getting that potassium from natural sources, which is, again, fruits and vegetables, particularly vegetables and green leafy vegetables. One other thing to know about that calcium supplement is there's another important ratio in our body, our calcium to magnesium ratio, which we should be keeping at about 2. Typical woman, because of all the calcium supplements they're taking, is up around 4. And going anywhere above about 2.6 has been shown to be unhealthy. That can contribute to heart disease, which is why women have now caught up to men in heart disease because of all the calcium supplementation. So that's another really important ratio to focus on, keeping that right around the 2. And a lot of that's making sure you're getting enough magnesium. And again, what's your best source of magnesium? Vegetables, particularly green leafy vegetables.
Wow. I just want to pause there because that's such a big and huge emphasis. And I know that and I won't repeat it because I'm not as familiar with that I need to be to talk about it, but I do know that there is a sex difference in terms of how much we sweat, the salty sweat piece. And so what does it mean in terms of our hydration? Well, females have lower needs in terms of sodium coming in, but yet we are taking in really high levels as we do sport, because there's such a worry of electrolytes, I am a coach thinking, okay, do you have electrolytes? Or we don't want to cramp. We don't want to get into this situation. So it perpetuates. And yet coming into the health, this is what's so incredible about this interview is this idea, foundation. Health is the foundation of performance. This is something that I'm really striving to get the message out. And this will affect our performance at the end of the day. Right? Absolutely.
Yep.
And
so
from a bone health, from a cramping health, from all of these other pieces, if you don't have that balance right, then Yeah.
Well, I mean, I could send you hundreds, if not thousands of studies showing this sodium potassium ratio and the calcium magnesium ratio has so many impacts on our health. And on top of that, the calcium magnesium, we really worry about taking that calcium supplement, but magnesium actually aids our body's ability to absorb calcium. So if you're taking a lot of calcium, but you're not getting sufficient magnesium, you're not actually going to absorb it. So really focusing on these 2 ratios in your diet is essential. And again, best way to get those ratios right is eating a whole lot of a variety of vegetables, but getting vegetables and fruit in your diet.
Yeah. Wow. That's okay. So that's at the end message there is eat eat whole foods. Make sure to
Always.
fruits and vegetables.
Really simple message at the end of the day. Yeah.
Forget
All
about
meat
training. We
Yeah.
don't need intervals
Yeah.
anymore.
Well, it's
Vegetables.
fascinating because it really is about, I mean, we really can simplify the message, and there, and I'll do that at the end. But Rob, you had one other point that I just want to bring up, because what is going to happen is the conversation is going to continue. I know that Fast Talk is investing and thinking about all the different ways that we can keep understanding how and when there's differences between males and females, when we need to highlight, when we don't in the future. So Rob, what is the other thing that you wanted just to highlight in terms of sex differences or things that we need to think about as female athletes in perimenopause and beyond?
Yeah, as we're realizing, you start talking about one thing, it leads to another, right? And this has been such a big, grand, broad conversation. But to enable us to do that, we didn't really get to talk about any details, and I don't want any audience member, any listener, I don't want you or anyone else to think that there aren't those differences in details, within women, within specific things like how does your body change? How does it react? How does it respond differently throughout phases, throughout pre, peri, and postmenopausal? There is so much conversation that can occur there that we very much had to gloss over to enable the rest of this conversation, that when we do talk about how your body uses glucose differently, how it responds to anaerobic or strength training differently throughout the phase, it would be great in the future to really be able to dive into that and give that topic sort of its due in depth, and not just try to slam that in among everything else.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The conversation must continue. I love it as well that we're bringing in other voices, that you're bringing in other voices within Fast Talk, and to also in perspective, because that's what we need. We're really trying to expand our knowledge, and it's rich. It's amazing what we have access to now, and that you're translating. I know that, Trevor, you're concerned yes, we're getting sciencey, but it's also in these conversations like on your podcast, that we can translate some of the science and make it make sense. And having that opportunity to talk to other coaches is important within that. I have one final question for you both, and I'm asking all the experts to answer this question, because we get into these conversations and we have so much passion and we just want to keep going and talking more. But can you share with me, was there one moment, or was it just a whole, this one thing led to another, in which you decided, I need to be in this field of exercise physiology, working with athletes, and how did that come about for each of you?
You want to go first?
Yeah, I can go first. It's really clear to me. I'm an egocentric person. And so I got into exercise science because I was really into track and field. I wanted to improve my own performance. And in all honesty, from undergrad through graduate degree and everything else, I was really focused on myself, and I learned science and I loved performance because of that. But really a big change happened. My first job out of graduate school was working in cardiac rehab. And to that date, I had avoided quote unquote old people because I didn't know how to connect with them. I thought that they were so different from me as a young athlete.
Right.
But working in cardiac rehab, because it was a phase 2 cardiac rehab program, meant that I worked with the same people for multiple weeks to months, which means you develop relationships with people. And it was at that point that I realized that even though somebody seems so apparently different from me, we actually do have a lot of connections and a lot of similarities. And that really flipped a switch in me to change from being so egocentric and learning all of this just for myself, but to begin learning this to be able to help people. And from that point forward, everything that I have done, my work at Boulder Center for Sports Medicine and everything else, has really been to help educate and bring this information to other people. And so for me, phase 2 cardiac rehab in Lake Placid, New York was my time.
Huh. That's neat. That's really, and that it was with the population that you didn't think it would be.
I was deathly afraid of quote unquote, again, old people, but I was obviously quite wrong to feel that way.
Oh, so cool. All right, Trevor, how about for you?
Oh boy, I'm trying to think of how to give you the short version of this story. I'll try to give you the rapid version.
We haven't given the short version of anything.
That's a good point.
Why start now?
That is not our way. If you're looking for concise, don't invite us on your show.
No,
we're not those people.
We talk a lot.
I had a couple really big moments in my life that led to this. And, if you ask me to describe my life has been a whole lot of accidentally taking the wrong turns and just being happy about that. I was actually, believe it or not, I started my career as a website developer. And one of the biggest moments in my life was I was handed the Philip Morris account to work on their new media. And I was young and it was a big name. So I was initially really excited about that.
You took up smoking so that you could understand your clientele?
I did not do that, but I will tell you,
good.
it was really interesting going to a meeting at their offices. They had a big bowl in the middle of the conference table with cigarettes in it. You could sit there in the conference, grab these cigarettes out and smoke during the meeting, which I did not do, but they could do this. But I was sitting in our photocopier room. Yes, this was the 90s. So we had a photocopier room at about 9 o'clock on a Friday and realized I am working this late on a Friday night for a company that sells cigarettes to kids, and had a real moral dilemma with that. My programmer for our team was still there at the office as well. So I went down and he and I started talking about it. And I said, does this bother you? And he said, no, because I love to program. I don't care about the end product. I love the process. And I fully respected that. But I then went, I don't. What I'm doing, what I'm contributing is really important, and made my resolution right there that whatever I do in my life, it's not going to be this. I need to do something where I feel like I'm adding some value to the world.
Wow.
And that led to a very long, sorted, lots of mistakes, lots of failures, trying to find that thing. And what it ended up being for me. So part of that was I said, well, let's go and see if I can, what life is like as an athlete. That at least be fun while I'm figuring it out. When I was training at the National Center up in Canada, I was taking classes just to keep my brain functioning. And I signed up for, I think, a psychology class. All I knew was it was in room 201, but there was a 201A and a 201B, and I walked into the wrong 201. And that was a physiology course. And I was too embarrassed to walk out in the middle of class. So I sat there and listened. I was like, this is kind of interesting. So I just kept coming back the rest of the semester. I'm sure I failed my psychology class because I never showed up once.
But you were ready to take the physiology exam.
At the end of the physiology class, I went up to the professor and said, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. I love this. How do I get into this?
What a beautiful story. Like, talk about walking into an open door. Like, we talk about, doors opening and walking in, and sometimes we just have to sit there and be there for a while.
Yep. Well, there's a Sheryl Crow song, and I'm sure she didn't originate this quote, but every time I hear it, she makes this she says this line: life is what happens while you're making plans. And I've never heard a more apt description of what has happened with my life.
Yeah. Wow. What a great, well, I am going to give you, thank you for that story. Thank you for sharing that, because it is really fascinating to see how we as experts all come into where we are to spend our time, our energy and our passions here. I'm going to leave you both with the last word here. And that is, I'm going to ask you to say, what is the one thing, that you want to leave the listeners of this session with? What is the one takeaway that you really want them to take on for themselves? I'll ask you, Trevor, first, and then you, Rob, to finish.
Yeah, there's a bunch. I think the one that I really want to leave with is find what works for you.
Perfect.
It's that N of one. We can quote all the science, but you are an N of one, and you need to find what really resonates for you.
For me, it's I think that we all know what healthy choices are. what we really need to do is to listen and to make those choices in the stress of world and everything else. Let's do a variety of different things, exercise intensities, exercise sports. Let's eat a variety of things as well. These are just general things that everybody knows and that everybody can action on.
Yeah.
But more than anything, if you're going to make a cake, make sure that it's a good cake.
Yeah.
Because that's what matters.
With real butter.
Work some vegetables into it.
Carrot cake is cake too.
It's so good. It's my favorite. All right. Well, thank you both for coming on, for sharing your knowledge, for sharing and researching and knowing and doing what you do, both here today and also for Fast Talk. I'm really, as I've mentioned, a fan. So thank you and continue on.
Terrific.
Thank you so much. This was a pleasure.
Great.